Thank you, everybody else. I when I don't work with agile teams, I really my center of effort is around leadership development and one-on-one coaching, 360s, and helping those leaders make sense of agile. And I want to say 20 years ago, I came across this format for me, for my personal work first, and then I realized how applicable it was to my work with organizations, in organizations, and made this more and more my center of effort. And then the virus hit, and I was sort of figuring that because it is very much about human connection and like how we relate personally, my heart was sinking for a little while, and it turns out this works quite well online, and the experience is maybe not quite as strong, but that's something more subtle that I notice in the comparison. Doing the work is astonishing, one way or the other. So maybe just a few words. I'm sort of thinking I'll try to give you a high-level overview in hopefully no more than 10-15 minutes. And that gives us about maybe 40 minutes to try it out. And that will be with, the work only works with real life examples. Unfortunately, there are no hypotheticals. And so it is an opportunity for one of you to serve as the focus and showcase how it might work and how it applies. So, what are systemic constellations? First, should we do a quick check-in? Thank you for sharing. Thank you, everybody. So, organizational constellations is a way for us to experience subterranean dynamics within teams and organizations. And I say subterranean because our usual way of making sense of the world doesn't capture it, doesn't notice it very well. These kinds of patterns and pulls we are mostly noticing through our bodies, either physically or emotionally. And so that's where we need to tune into if we want to find out what's happening below the surface. And just for an orientation, the kinds of things that social systems track or pay attention to in this subterranean layer have everything to do with how self-organization shows up. So I call them the principles, the 3 principles of self-organization. And yeah, let's just jump right into them. The first principle is the need to value contribution, the value of our contribution. So groups track very carefully who is contributing how much. And for example, you know, the engineer that is genius and has really high level technical skills may be very socially awkward and politically inept. And so it's easy to overlook the substantive contribution to the well-being of the company that they're bringing to the table. and are sometimes overlooked for promotions, or and maybe they shouldn't be promoted because they're really not that good at managing, but then some other way of recognizing the value of their contribution is needed. So we're having groups track sort of skill and expertise. Um, they track how long ago somebody joined the system. So the mm, lifetime service. Someone who has been in the organization for a really long time has more weight in decision making, even if they're not not the highest man on the totem pole or highest woman on the totem pole. When they're speaking up, they generally get listened to differently. And the last one that we're overly focused on is the contribution of being willing to take on responsibility, which we usually associate with title and how high up someone is in the organization. So a CEO who is responsible for the well-being of the entire organization carries a different burden than someone who is at the front desk. And generally, we are overemphasizing that aspect at the cost of the other two. And when we're not appropriately recognizing those contributions, then the group has a sneaky way of atoning or sabotaging efforts. And oftentimes we refer to that as sort of toxic organizations or toxic tendencies. And those toxic tendencies often have something to do with sort of a violation in that subterranean layer. That's why we're caring about those principles. The second principle is relatively straightforward. It's the principle of balance in giving and taking. So when someone does us a favor, we have this natural inclination to want to return the favor. Now there's sort of, there's a useful and effective way where that exchange continues and we're increasing collaboration through it. And it also feeds sort of like the good old boy networks and has sort of some ways that it shows up that is starting to exclude others. And then it becomes not so useful, because in the old boys network, they are acting against the third principle of self-organization, and that is the inclusion of all stakeholders. Everybody who is affected by decisions should have a voice at the table in about sort of an appropriate measure of the impact of those decisions. So if I'm highly impacted, I should have a lot of say in the decision making. And if I'm really just sort of a tangential bystander, then my opinion should be heard, but it may not have a lot of sway. And as I indicated earlier, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They tend to overlap, and they tend to, there are all these areas where you're serving one of those principles at the expense of another. And so it's very difficult to come up with hard and fast rules around it. And so the experience of it is that they're not necessarily predictive, but we can use them we need to do a constellation. We need to go through the exercise that I'm going to introduce here in a minute in order to sense what in this situation has sort of precedence and is more important in the contribution to however the behavioral pattern, the institutional behavior pattern happens. And so it's the exercise that informs us. It's phenomenological and not predictive. We can't come up with rules and just predict how an organization or a group or a team may react. So far, any questions or comments just to see a little bit about how it is sinking in? Go for it, Olaf.
You called them principles of self-organization. Is self-organization critical in this context, or is it just like any level of organization, like any kind of organization, of people organizing themselves, each other, through a hierarchy perhaps traditionally, or is this truly just for Scrum teams that are self-organizing? Okay.
That's a great question. Self-organizing, I mean, the reality is that even in the most like hierarchical command and control structures, the behavior that arises within those structures is highly self-organizing. People are breaking rules all the time. They're sneaking around each other. There's sort of behind door politics to get anything done because the official structure has serious limitations, both in speed and decision making. And so people get very creative how they self-organize around these constraints that we call organizational design. And so in any context, human behavior is mostly self-organizing, and we are creating rules of the road and some guardrails that are more or less helpful in accomplishing an outcome. Yeah.
So from what would you say, without going too far down to it, I mean, and feel free to take it offline too, but what's the lineage? Where does family systems come from? Kind of in a nutshell, and like if one wanted to learn a little bit more about it, you know, what might you recommend?
Where to start? Most obviously, it comes out of family systems counseling. Mm-hmm. And most obviously Virginia Satir, who started to do family sculptures. But there was a lot of enrolling, and it was still a fairly cognitive process, as you'll find out soon. This has very little to do with our higher level of knowledge. I indicated earlier it's mostly somatic, and so Bert Hellinger, the German pioneer of this work, got started somewhere in the mid 80s and published his first book in the early 90s. And so if you're looking around, I call it systemic coaching. A lot of people use the word organizational constellations. And there's the corollary in the family world, the family constellation. And it started out of the family systems work. And then people realized like, oh, everything we learn within the family, we bring into our organizations.
Yeah.
And it actually shows up in very similar ways. With one notable exception, or a few notable, like the biggest notable exception is, in a family system, you have no choice but to belong, even though we sometimes do a whole lot to confirm and feel like we would belong more. But fundamentally, we will always be the kid of our parents, and there's just no escaping that.
Sure.
We're part of the system. And in organizations, belonging is conditional. And there's more or less explicit an agreement about if you're contributing X, you're part of the team or part of the community. It doesn't have to be a formal thing. It could be, you know, the chess club or the bowling club. That's very informal, but there are still rules of belonging, more or less strictly enforced, and obviously with organizations, contracts, and the likes. And then we're entering a system, And with entering the system, we're now exposed to the full institutional knowledge of that system. And if we're getting tired of it, or somebody else decides that we're not contributing to our agreement, then we exit the system. And so it's conditional, and it should be. And we can make a whole host of mistakes about, firing someone unfairly has an impact on the system. So there's that can go. It's tricky as well.
And what is, if I may, one follow-up question is like, is there any particular stance or approach toward like non-duality, where you're straddling both worlds, or is it squarely you're either or, it's mutually exclusive?
What is the polarity? What's the
Whether
either or?
in one system or not, is there ever a case where, how does, in general, how do you approach that? Or is that just part of the fun, so to speak?
It's part of the fun, and there's some gray area where we would have to test it. Mm-hmm. But obviously, if you have a power plant that is polluting the neighborhood, then the neighborhood implicitly becomes part of the system, even though in legal terms in our culture, we're not acknowledging that, or we're having a hard time acknowledging it. And every so often somebody wins a lawsuit for the pollution. But by and large, that's an externality that we ignore until the law forces us to kind of abide.
So if I may clarify, it's almost like where inclusion is almost involuntary, right? I mean, the mere fact that you exist and you're standing next to it, if there's any kind of contextual interaction, you're part of that. You're part of it in some way.
And
whether you like it or not.
And depending on how tangential that impact is, you are more or less affected by it. So there are lots of systems that we are sort of part of, but we're so removed from it that we won't feel the effect and they won't feel us. And so it's okay to not consider it highly.
Okay, thank you.
All right, anything else? Sort of at the high level, what we're up to, or? All right, so maybe I should shift gear a little bit and go to the tactical and practical. Who has seen constellations already? Had an experience of it? All right, so I don't know where Edward stands, but that's fine. So in tactical and practical terms, here we have, it's time to go to the Google document, because that is our virtual space, like so much. We're sharing a world in Google. And if you're having trouble, shout out with that link. Awesome. So in the real world, we would be sitting in a circle right now. And one of you will have an opportunity to look at those subterranean dynamics in a context that you are in and that you are affected by. So curiosity about what happens at the Microsoft board, or what they're discussing at the COVID council, won't do us any good, because we're not direct stakeholders for us to actually have access. So it needs to be personal, and you need to be affected. And then we can, in a brief conversation, identify what an easiest, very simplified representation of that dynamic, who's part of the dynamic. We'll start to sort of distill a very simplified version of that. And again, in the real world, we would then ask volunteers to represent that aspect in somebody else's system. So, it's I'm a consultant. I work with a team. They are fighting constantly. Everything we're trying to do, it's sort of chronic. It's a chronic pattern that keeps coming up. And no matter what we're trying and how we're trying to influence it, we are having a hard time resolving the issue. Or it could be as simple as, yeah, I have this chronic tension with my manager or with one of my direct reports, and it is frustrating me, and I need to figure out how to improve it. Or I'm struggling with this team, our team is struggling with this team over there, and we can't come to agreements. And those are the kinds of situations that we then would represent. And just for simplicity, taking that example of the teams, we would have a representative for team one, and a person representing team one, and a person representing team two. And I would secretly on a piece of paper designate who is representing who or what. And so the person who volunteers for the representation doesn't actually have to have any cognitive knowledge of who they're representing. That's a sneaky way of helping us to stay out of our head and out of the story, and how we've made up whether the boss is justified or not, or all those judgments we're not interested in, and they get in the way. And and without it, it's much easier to drop into our body and to start saying, when we're standing in the circle, to notice like, oh, I don't trust that person, or oh, I really like that person, I want to go closer. It's those kinds of very basic like physical space orientation, distance, where I look, where my attention goes. All of those are subtle signals that inform us about what's happening in the dynamic. And with simple sentences and it has a little ritualistic flavor of acknowledging what is so, and probably naming what in the real world is unnameable, prohibited to speak about. If we are in this space naming it, then suddenly our relationship to these people changes, and new solutions become possible. And it turns out, however, those sentences and these gestures that we are like in a lab, a petri dish in the lab, we're experimenting, what kind of movements might have an effect here. And when they're showing to have an effect here, that's a pretty good indication that that's something we want to try to do in the real world to resolve the conflict. Now, we'll have to do with a lot more grace and probably over time and multiple conversations, and not in a single sentence. But we kind of now have an inner compass, an inner idea of what wants to come to the surface, be acknowledged, and having gotten there, that then the agreements are, the commitment level changes, and the whole dynamic and how people trust each other will change in the real world. And that is the power of this exercise. It gives us a blueprint of what is worth trying in the real world. Now that we're not able to stand in the same room, I have come up with these simplified, I'm sharing my screen just for a moment. Here we go. I've come up with this simplified symbolic world, and we can move, these are grouped shapes, and we can just move them as a group. And here on this handle, I can change the direction, and this way we can start modeling in an abstract way what would otherwise happen in the real world. Is everybody comfortable with the idea of moving these things around? And if you, yeah. All right, so let me get us back into a neutral place. I just want to quickly demonstrate how we are doing the virtual world thing instead of being able to just simply move our bodies. And at the beginning of the exercise, the person who is presenting the issue, the focus, he or she, there's no she, he will set up, will actually position these little figurines, if we have 2 or 3, 4 representatives, will position them to get the exercise started. And it is if you're the volunteer, you just in your own mind designate, oh, I am using the blue figure to represent, and I'm sensing into the place that the blue figure is standing in. And apparently our brain still knows how to do this. And when the shapes are starting to shift, you will notice how your inner experience in your body starts to feel differently. More trusting, warmer, friendlier, or getting angry, or some other version, getting afraid and worried. And your job as a representative is to just, in very neutral terms, describe what's happening in your body. Even though your higher brain function are likely to have an opinion about it and complain that this is sort of stupid and what the hell is going on. But we can let that chatter go on without having to pay much attention to it, and just concentrate more about from like neck downwards what's happening and report on it. Any questions about sort of that tactical and practical aspect? All right. I think, let me see, where can I unshare? Because you all have access to it, so I don't need to monopolize your screens. So now the question is, who is the gutsy volunteer to present us a situation